Names Not Numbers allows our students to experience the Holocaust as not just something in the past, not just something that is historic, a piece of history, but it takes the Holocaust and makes it relevant. It makes it real. It gives it an experiential element to it. It allows them to create educational materials that is not just for us to see, but it's for future generations to see as well. I want to thank Names Not Numbers for bringing this incredible program to our school. I want to thank all of our participants, our students, and our teachers who have worked really hard on creating this incredible program and film. I hope you enjoy.
My name is Audrey Ben-Susan, and my son Noah participated in Names Not Numbers this year. I participated in the March of the Living in 1996 with a delegation that left from Montreal, Canada. That trip changed my life. Being able to walk through the various concentration camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, and being able to do so with a living survivor and hear their stories firsthand is something that is embedded in my heart and in my memory for life. Knowing that Noah was able to interview survivors and hear their stories firsthand is an experience that I know he will cherish for the rest of his life, especially knowing that by the time that he gets to go on a trip like the March of the Living, there may not be any living survivors to accompany him. This is an experience that I know he will never forget, and I'm extremely grateful to Names Not Numbers and to Hebrew Academy for giving him this opportunity.
Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me a truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers Oral History Film Documentary Project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work, their filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
Jewish culture is beautiful and happy, but this was a horrible interruption, and we do need to know about that.
Hatred is what creates this. Do not let this happen again.
Each and every one of us can stand up to evil.
Talk about it. Don't let it forget.
I first heard about the Holocaust when I was in around 3rd or 4th grade.
I was sort of confused. I didn't really understand what everything was.
I was shocked that something like that could happen and like no one would do anything about it.
So our rabbi came to talk to us, and he taught us the importance of passing down the story of the Holocaust.
Let's go back to the end of World War II. There were a small number of Jews who survived the Holocaust, and they came out of the worst experiences that anyone can ever imagine. And they started to rebuild their lives. In the beginning, they would tell their stories, but people didn't believe them. And they stopped telling their stories. Nobody's going to believe it anyway. I might as well just go on with my life. And that was true until 1961. And the state of Israel sent Mossad agents, Israeli agents, all the way to South America, to Argentina. And in Argentina, they captured a man named Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was the architect of the Holocaust. They kidnapped him in the middle of the night, put him in a car, put him on a plane, and brought him back to Israel. And the state of Israel decided they were going to try him. Over 100 survivors testified in the trial. They were able to tell their stories. Since then, they've been telling their stories. You have an incredibly unique opportunity to hear the stories directly from survivors. Your children will not have the opportunity to meet a Holocaust survivor. You have to tell the story. Pass it on.
I think it's really important, as one of the last generations, I'll be able to speak to a Holocaust survivor to know their story and know our past.
It's important to learn about the history of the Jewish people.
The reason I wanted to be in Names Not Numbers was I thought it was really important for someone who didn't have a Holocaust survivor member in their family to learn about it from a different view of just reading biographies, because it's much more personal.
I get more knowledge about the Holocaust. I get to learn things that other people don't necessarily get to learn.
I volunteered for Names Not Numbers so I could understand the story of the Holocaust and pass it down to the next generation.
This will always be a part of our history, and it will never be forgotten.
Today, you're going to watch direct testimony from a Holocaust survivor.
The movie that we watched was about a Holocaust survivor, and we learned about his story and how he got out of the camp. You could see he was crying, he was really showing his emotion.
The film was pretty impressive. I could actually feel how he went through, even though I can't imagine being in his spot.
The part that was hard for me was when he was talking about reuniting with his brother and how he thought he would never see him again, and that made me emotional.
His story inspired me to never give up.
Today, we spoke to a journalist who spoke to us about how to interview someone and how to ask questions.
I will share with you whatever knowledge I have as a professional journalist. The Holocaust didn't start with the mass killings at the concentration camps. It started with the small steps. And those are the intimate details that you want your survivor to tell you. You want to ease into that conversation by first having them describe where and how they grew up. And once you've established that comfort level with one another, you can start asking the deeper questions.
We learned how to be sensitive towards the survivors.
Who, what, where, when, and why. These are the journalism basics. And if you've answered all those, then you have the makings of a good story.
A good interviewer knows who they're interviewing. They know what type of questions to ask.
You have to listen to their answer to really be able to make follow-up questions.
I can't stress enough that before an interview, it's necessary to do the research.
We did some role-playing at the end, and I got to be the person interviewing, and I had to ask her questions about her life. It was kind of hard, but I think I could learn a lot from it.
We had a class on filmmaking. It was a good way to learn something that I didn't know before.
We're going to talk about how we're going to use the camera and how we're going to use the audio and what things we have to watch out for. On the day of the shoot, we're going to have two cameras, medium and close-up. You want to be intimate with the survivor. You want the audience to have an intimacy with the survivor.
We learned about the rule of thirds.
The person should not be in the middle of the camera, should be on one side, based on where they're looking.
We go thirds from left to right, thirds from top to bottom, and we're going to place the person's head a third from the left or a third from the right, and their eye should also be a third from the top.
I thought the filmmaking class was cool. It was something I never thought I would get to do.
I think it's very cool that we could use professional equipment. It makes me feel like a professional photographer.
I'm looking forward to interviewing the survivors.
I've never had an experience like that. It's unique.
It's a big moment, and I've been waiting for this.
I want to be able to tell my children that I made a movie about Holocaust survivors and I interviewed them and talked to them face to face.
I hope to gain a different perspective on looking at the Holocaust.
Nowadays, people say the Holocaust isn't real. I want to get her story out so everybody could really know what she went through.
My great-grandfather survived the Holocaust, and I feel like he would be very proud of me.
Both of my great-grandparents on my grandfather's side were Holocaust survivors. I was never really old enough for them to tell me their stories directly, and they're not here anymore, so I think that they'd be very proud of me for doing this.
I am interviewing Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff.
I am going to interview David Mermelstein.
I'm going to be interviewing Laszlo Selly.
I'm interviewing Anita Carl.
My name is David Mermelstein. I was born in Czechoslovakia, December 21, 1928. My parents had a business. They were selling wine, beer, cigarettes, tobacco. I had grandparents lived in the house, my parents, 2 older brothers, then me, then a sister, and then twins, 2 brothers. When I was 5 years old, started to go, we called it cheder, that's Hebrew school. Started Friday night, an hour before the candle lighting. All the stores were closed. There was 12 stores owned by Jews, and till we did the davening and everything, and came home, sat down to a table, a big table, and we had Shabbat dinner.
My name is Miriam Klein-Kasanoff. I was born in Košice, Slovakia, November 13th, 1936 or 37. I don't have my birth certificate. I had a beautiful, loving mother named Sarah, and my dad's name was Moritz. My father was a young rabbi. My mother was a homemaker, a mommy. And in 1940, I had a new baby brother who was named Tibor. My Jewish life that I can remember before the war, because I was very young, probably the best memory I have are Shabbat dinners. Every Friday night, we had a beautiful dinner. My mother lit the candles beautifully like this on silver candlesticks. And my father made the prayer over wine. And then we had a delicious meal.
My name is Anita Carl. I was born in Poland in a city called Lwów on May 26, 1938. I was born into a very large, Orthodox, well-to-do family. My mother was one of 10, and my father was one of 6 brothers. All of them lived in Lemberg, except of my eldest uncle, who lived in Vienna. We lived in a very large city. It was the 3rd largest city in Poland. It was a modern, cosmopolitan city. In my house, we were 3 little girls. I was the middle child. The holidays were a very wonderful affair. Shabbat was celebrated. The whole family got together at my grandmother's house.
My name is Laszlo Selly. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, in 1937. My father was a small businessman. My mother was a homemaker. They were very nice, very sweet people, very loving, and very family-oriented. I have a twin brother. We lived in a regular neighborhood in a very nice section of the city. I did not have much of a Jewish life as such, because Anti-Semitism was very rampant in Hungary even before the Holocaust. We did have a menorah, I think, but I don't think we practiced Judaism much at all.
Before the Germans came, there was anti-Semitism in Poland, as it always was and it still is.
In front of our building had a little garden, and there was a sandbox. And we used to play with the other kids in the building until those kids came to us one by one and told us that they can no longer play with us because their parents forbid them to play with Jews. All Jews had to wear a yellow star in front of their clothes. And one day we were playing out in this garden when a man looked in the gate, saw the two of us there playing, and started screaming at us, "Lousy Jews, wait until I get my hands on you," and started rushing us. And both my brother and I, we ran screaming back to our apartment. And there was nothing my parents could do about it. And from that moment on, we not played outside any longer.
When the war broke out, Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans, but the state where I came from was called the Carpathian Mountains, and they gave that to Hungary. In May 1941, a week after Pesach, 2 Hungarian policemen and a German policeman came in, and they said, "We've taken your business."
The actual Nazis that came into Košice trained the Hungarian police. By 1940, they were taking all the Jewish men in the community to what they called slave labor camps. So my life changed when my dad was taken to one of those camps. My mother became hysterical when my dad was taken away. I mean, I can still hear her screaming, "Leave him alone, leave him alone." And her hiding me in a closet. And then when I came out, he was gone. And my mother said that he had gone to a camp because we were Jewish, which I didn't understand. My mom had a twin sister that lived nearby. And so my memory is that we did stay for a while with my Aunt Lily.
Since my father had a little shop and worked with 3 or 4 people, he could not keep the business because it was not allowed. So he handed the business over to one of his old employees. And the moment the man took the business over, he fired my father, stating that he will not employ Jews. I remember the presence of the Germans all of a sudden on the streets, trucks and the tanks rolling through Budapest. And I remember many people cheering and waving and yelling. Then all of a sudden, the Hungarian Nazis came out also. They were harassing Jews on the streets, stopping them, beating them, cutting their hair off. There was a general fear. And you can feel that fear.
The Germans came to Lviv. They came into our house on the 15th of September of 1941. This is the day my youngest sister was born. And my mother was in bed. She had just given birth. They took everything of value. They confiscated all our goods. And they told my mother and father that we had 24 hours to move to the ghetto. And so after the 24 hours were given, we had to move to this deteriorated part of the city. And we had to do that under penalty of death. Life in ghetto was a horror story. It was a man-made hell where people had no rights, people had no food, people had no clothing. After a few days, we grew hungry. We grew cold. But the worst of all was the people dying from many, many diseases. People were dying on the street. The rations of the food were also terrible. I remember standing in line. My daily ration consisted in 1 cup of water with 1 small piece of stale bread, dark bread. This had to last me for 24 hours, and I ate it crumb after crumb to make it last. I was one day sitting and playing with my little cousin in the dirt, and a German officer came by, a young man, and he looked at us playing there, and he took out a chocolate bar. And he said to us, "Who wants this chocolate bar?" Can you imagine little girls of 4 years old, hungry? We both got up and we ran to him. My cousin was faster than I was, and she reached him before I did. He picked her up, he sat her on his lap, and with one hand he took out the chocolate bar, and with the other one he took out his revolver and shot her in the head.
We were the last 400,000 Jews to ship to the ghetto. When we got to the ghetto, there was a fence and people were on the other side. And we were talking to them, and some of them touched the wires. They knew that they kill you, and they wanted to kill themselves. So they did. So my oldest brother came and took the 2 of us, and he made us promise that we would never do anything to help them, to help the Germans.
A new law came out that Jews cannot live just where they want to. They have to move into a ghetto, or actually in the case of Budapest, into a designated Jewish house. They painted a yellow star in front of a building that became a Jewish house. I remember leaving our apartment, carrying our blankets and pillows, because that's all we could carry. You know, we were little kids. And our neighbors were rushing into the apartment as we left, trying to grab whatever they wanted. We were in this designated Jewish house, living with 4 or 5 families in a tiny little apartment with 1 bathroom. Nobody could wash. Nobody could heat water for a bath.
My father was in a Hungarian slave labor camp called Sharash Potok. Ultimately, he managed to escape from there. One was able to escape from the labor camps because many of them were manned or guarded by the local gendarme or Hungarian police. So they were bribable, or perhaps you knew them. Perhaps they were from your very community. So there are 2 or 3 versions of how my dad got out. Different people remember different things. One version is that my dad told the guard that if he let him out for the weekend, he would go home and get money and bring it back to him, but to let him at least go home for the weekend to visit his family. Another version is that he told the guard that my mother was very ill and that he had to go home to see his wife. Whatever the reason that worked, he got out. But he was supposed to go back. So when he came home, he said to my mother, "I told you we should have left a long time ago. Now it's too late. They're going to kill all the Jews of Europe. I heard that in the camp. I have the paperwork to leave. We need to leave now." And my mother said, "But I can't. I have a new baby, and I don't want to leave my twin sister. And how about your parents?" So my dad said, "Well, if we don't leave, they're going to come get me. And you'll never see me again. And eventually they'll kill you too. They're going to kill all the Jews of Europe." So my mother said, "Okay."
After living in this horror for 2 years, they decided to liquidate the ghetto. They wanted to exterminate all the Jewish people, and to that effort, they had built the concentration camps throughout Poland. And so at one point, they brought into our ghetto 150,000 human beings, 150,000 Jews. From there on, they would put them on these cattle trains.
There was nothing interesting coming out of the ghetto. Some of us young guys went to work, take a shovel or brooms to sweep up, clean up. We didn't know what was happening outside or anything. No news, no nothing.
When they decided to close the ghetto, they decided also to kill all the children that were younger than 12 years of age. When my mother heard that they would do that, she decided not to sit by anymore. She told my father that she would try to escape with the 3 little girls against all odds.
They took us to the train, filled up the wagon, and then they put in a bucket of water on the right and an empty bucket for facilities on the left side. And the doors were locked. It didn't take long, and the children had to go to the toilet. So that one bucket, you can imagine what happens, 100 people, and how many go. The train stopped, and the doors opened, and rushed us off, leave everything there. All of a sudden we see old men and women walking with canes, young girls, about 5 years old, playing with dolls, and boys playing with balls. That's what we saw of Auschwitz.
We had an aunt, and she really wasn't an aunt. She was just a family friend, and she wasn't Jewish. What's more, she was a member of the Nazi Party. And she came to us one day and told my parents that she will take both my brother and I to her place and see if she can, shield us. So we were given new names, and we were warned never ever to tell anybody our real name. She had a little store, a little tobacco store, and she lived right behind this store in a dark, dingy little room. And she had a young woman working for her. And this young woman somehow felt that something is not right and kept asking my brother and I for our real name. And we would never tell her, except this one time she came to me with a piece of candy. And she said she will give me this candy if I tell her my real name. And let me tell you, I wanted that candy real bad. And I told her. And my aunt overheard that, fired the girl, threw her out of there immediately. And within 5 minutes, we were on our way back to the designated Jewish house and perhaps to wait for the deportation.
There was a young woman in Czechoslovakia named Gizzy Fleischman, and she had started a rescue network. And so the word got out among the network that there were ways to escape Europe. There were ships waiting in Lisbon, Portugal. My mom took a lot of things. It's amazing. I have a whole living room full of pictures. She grabbed some jewelry, and my dad took all the money that he had, that he could get fast. Our escape was a harrowing one for a 5-year-old. My memories of that are lots of darkness, lots of trains, and more trains.
In the ghetto of Lviv, the Germans, the officers, and many of the high-ranking policemen and others, they had their family brought from Germany, and they lived in neighboring houses. And every day they would come and visit, and they would stay there with their husbands, and then at 5 o'clock they would leave the ghetto. So my mother dressed us up nicely so we would look like we did not belong in the ghetto. And in the crowd of visitors, she mixed in there, and since they were children, of the soldiers and the officers visiting, she walked out with the 3 little girls and no one stopped her. The first thing she did was go to the train station and she boarded the first train. The train station in Lviv has a wonderful dome of crystal, and it is made with Greek columns. And from each column, there hanged a man or a woman with a sign in German saying, "This is what happens to the Jews who tried to escape." We boarded the train, and she sat next to this woman, and she had some bundles with her, and she put them down next to this baggage of this woman. And she said to her, "Please watch my children. I have to go to the bathroom or something." And immediately when she came back, she started to rummage amongst the things and started to scream, "Where is my purse? Where is my purse?" And so she looked and looked, and the woman started looking, and she said, "I'm sorry, I was watching over your things and over the children, but someone must have stolen your purse." So my mother started to cry and scream, and she said, "This is where all my documents are." And the woman said, "Don't worry, when the conductor will come and to check the train tickets and the German to check the papers, I will be your witness that your purse was stolen." So my mother was smart. She had no purse. We arrived at the end of the station into a city called Buchach. We got off. My mother spoke to the priest of the city of Buchach, and she told him that she was the wife of a Polish officer, and we needed help. And so my life as a Catholic girl began.
Dr. Mengele was staying on a stage like, and I looked, he motioned to the left, and there were my parents, grandfather, 2 younger brothers and a sister, and they went to the left. And the next thing I hear, my 2 brothers are calling, "We have to go." He showed them to go to the right. And I stopped because I didn't know if I should go to the left with my parents or go to the right with my brothers. I kept running to the right. Why I ran to the right, I don't know. But I think God had something to do with it. Because there was a Jewish man to try to direct you where to go. So when I came there, he said in Yiddish, "How old are you?" I said, 15. He says, no, tell him 17. You hear? And stretch your face and pinch yourself. You look healthier and go in line fast. So I went, my 2 brothers were standing. I went between them and I stepped on their shoes. We are not there that long. They were just taken every day, so many people were shipped. And one morning they came, "You guys go on this truck and you guys on that." And we were separated with the oldest brother.
We started out the journey December 1940. In February, we ended up in Spain, and we got stopped in Spain. Spain was not Nazi occupied, but they were in sympathy with the Nazis. We were put into a hotel, and we were told that we could stay there for 1 week, but that if we didn't get our papers in order, we would be sent back to Czechoslovakia. So we were literally imprisoned in a room in a hotel. And I have a document that is very emotional for me whenever I read it. It's a letter that my dad wrote with the help of a non-Nazi German tourist. And he felt sorry for this little family. So he asked my dad, "What can I do to help you?" And my dad said, "Well, I need to get a letter out to the officials in Lisbon that I have reservations for a ship to leave in March." So this German non-Nazi tourist helped my dad write a letter. In it, he says, "Dear members, Jewish members of the Lisbon community, I am here in a hotel room with my wife and with 2 small children. Please help us. We have been on the road for 3 or 4 months. I've spent all my money. I have no money to even buy food. My wife and I are used to hunger, but it hurts me to see my little children crying from hunger." Begging the Jews of the Lisbon community to please get this family out. And ultimately they did, because the next thing I know, in March, we were in Lisbon, Portugal.
My mother went to the police station and she was interrogated to prove that she was not a Jew. And then at the end, they brought in a Bible and she swore on the Bible. They made her swear on the Bible that to the 3rd generation, there was not a drop of Jewish blood in our veins. Every Sunday, we went to church. At that time, I was 5 years old. I forgot about being Jewish. Slowly, it left me, and I realized that I liked very much this new world that now I belonged to. My mother rented a room in a house that belonged to a Polish woman, and every day, if I misbehaved, she would tell me, "If you don't behave, the Jew is going to get you." So slowly I developed the fear of the Jews. One time, a German officer came into my house and he said, "There are rumors that you have a Jewish child here." So my mother looked at him, made the sign of the cross, and she says, "Jesus, Mary, how dare you? This is my house, and these are my daughters. There are no Jews here," and she slammed the door in his face.
After we were sent to a camp, so they took 10 people and put us to work on the cleanup for a railroad track. There were 2 old German civilians in charge of the project. So I walked over to him. I had the guts. I spoke German. So I told him that his leather boots are very dirty, that I could clean it for him. He looked at me because he saw the number, no name. So he gave me a nickname, Fitzko Fatzko, a nasty boy like. Then one morning I woke up, I had a temperature, and I collapsed. So they dragged me in to the what we call the dead house, and took all my clothes, shoes, everything away, gave me a T-shirt. There were 4 people in a single bed, nothing but boards. In the morning they gave you a cup of coffee, at lunch a cup with soup, but we were lucky to find the potato peel. The people in the 3rd room were there the longest, and either they passed or they needed the room, so they just threw them out at night alive, and we could hear the yeoman the crying. Then all of a sudden 2 guys came in, and I hear that they calling Fitzko Fatzko, and then that man is there by the door, and he says, "Fitzko Fatzko, you here? Come on out, I need you at work." So I forced myself, but I went out to work. I made it.
A typical day, I would get up, go to a school, and then in the afternoon I would play like a normal child does. And on weekends, there was, of course, the going to church, putting on my only dress, a white dress, and my only pair of shoes that I had for Sunday. My mother was able to rescue my father from the ghetto and bring him to this room where we lived. And my father was hidden in a closet in the room. and we were not allowed ever to see him. But one night I was very sick with angina, and we had no antibiotics, and my mother really thought I would not make it to the next morning. And in the middle of the night, my father came out, and he sat with me, and he held me, and he had a scarf around his neck that he took and put around my neck to make me feel better. And the next day I asked my mother, who was this wonderful man who held me and who sat with me all night? And my mother said, there was no one. You were delirious because your fever was so high. But I had the scarf around my neck. And so I have the scarf with me until today. Buchach was a city that was evacuated by the Germans when the Russians were coming. So the Germans decided to take all the population with them on these terrible marches. And we had to walk with them. We were going towards Krakow. My father was not able to come with us because he was in hiding. 2 days after we left, he was discovered. He was taken to the nearby forest, made to dig his own grave, and he was shot. I don't know where he lies. So after that night when I was ill and he gave me his scarf, was the last time I saw him.
3 months later, people were going to get cement to a big station. Then I saw my brother. So I ran up on the wagon, stayed, talked to him while they loaded. Then the soldier came that it's time to go. So I said goodbye, hugged and kissed, never saw him again. The Russians were getting closer, so one morning they woke us up and we going. And we started to walk all day. People were dying. They had a wagon, picked them up on the wagon. Then we got to a big farm, chased out the horses, cows, and put us on the floor there. They took us to the train, and it was cold already. And the train didn't have no tops, so it was snowing, and we were sitting as close as we can. We got to a camp in Austria called Mauthausen. The guy went in, came back, that we cannot get in. In the morning, they sent us to another camp called Ebensee in the Tyrol Mountains. And we stayed there, worked. My job was on a little train, hook up the wagons, put in the pin or take out, and I had a little stop sign, and the guy stopped. And one day, he didn't stop, and it smashed my hand. Woke up in the morning, and it was stuck, swollen up like this. And they took me to their hospital. Started in the first room, 4 people in a bed on the boards, and a piece of blanket. And when we got to the middle of the second room, I was already half gone.
There were about 1,000 Jewish people living in Lisbon, Portugal in 1941. They put all the refugees into, like little rooming houses, pensions they call them, while we were all waiting to get on the ships that we had papers for. Well, in our case, we missed the ship. We didn't get there in time. The Lisbon officials said, well, we can keep you here for a little while, but if you don't get your papers together and your visas and everything, then we'll send you back. Everybody was very anxious to send the Jews back to their deaths, ultimately. It just looked like we weren't going to make it. My mother told me years later that at that moment, she wanted to give me and my baby brother away so that we could survive.
My parents got a hold of some papers from a Swedish diplomat called Raoul Wallenberg. And this diplomat decided to save as many Jews as they can and gave us Swedish citizenship papers. And also he took us out of this building and took us over to another building that he had that had a little plaque in front saying this property is Swedish diplomatic property, in the hope that the Nazis will recognize this. But quite frankly, the Nazis really didn't care. Budapest was under siege by the Soviet army, and they were pressing the Germans from the east, and the Allies were coming up from the west. So by this time, Germany knew that the war was lost. They stopped the deportations of the Jews from Budapest to the death camps. But the killing of the Jews did not stop. They were taken over by the Hungarian Nazis. They herded people out of this building and they took them down to the banks of the Danube, lined them up, and they shot them. We heard the cries and we heard the screams of the people as they realized what was about to happen to them. We heard the orders being given and yelled. We heard the machine gun fire. And then we listened to the silence and knew that they were all dead. And we also knew that sooner or later they will come to our building and that it will happen. And then one day they did. They came to the building and told us that tomorrow morning everybody has to be lined up in front of the building. And that was really the worst night of my life. We all hoped that the morning would never come. Early that morning, we heard the rifle butts being banged on the front door, and the door had to be opened up. And there were two Soviet soldiers standing there with their submachine guns looking for Germans. The Soviet army took the street that we lived on that night. Had they been only one day late, I would not be here today to tell you the story. The feeling is very, very difficult to describe. You feel this relief. You know, this big weight is lifted from your shoulder. We realize that we will stay alive, which is incredible.
The day of liberation for me was just like any other day. We were liberated while we were in Krakow in Poland by the Russians.
The next morning we got up and there was no lights on and no soldiers. Somebody hollered out, "Let's go out, see what's going on," and came running in. There are no soldiers, the gates are open, and they saw tanks coming in. And when they came closer, they saw an American flag on the front of the tank. We pulled with the fingers and pushed with the legs till we got out. We estimated it took us 2 to 3 hours. Within minutes, they started to put up a big tent. And some of them came and brought army cots. And they started to feed us with a teaspoon every hour, day and night, for 6 weeks. And after 2 months, I was able to walk. I came out of the hospital and I couldn't find my brother. One friend of his that I knew from home too, I asked him, and the way he talked, so I figured out that he didn't want to tell me what happened. But I couldn't find him. After 2 weeks, we took a train to go home. Nobody came home. The other brother didn't make it either. So I went to the next town, see if anybody from my cousin's family came home. And there was one young guy. The Russians started to come. People were running.
After my father went back to our apartment, but there was somebody else living in there. So they just moved on and we went to one of our relatives' apartments and they weren't there. They spent the war someplace else. And my father broke down the door and went in. And that's where we stayed until they came back the city was not recognizable. The city was in total ruin. There wasn't a building that was not damaged by shooting, by bombing. Budapest was very heavily bombed by both the Allies and the Soviets. I remember standing by the window watching the planes flying over Budapest and dropping the bombs. I could see the bombs falling down.
We had made our way eventually to Germany. I was 10 years old. The Americans and the Allied people came to Berlin, divided Berlin, and on the American section, they were helping all the survivors and the Jewish people. To them, it was a miracle that my mother was able to save 3 little children. That was something that was unheard of. When we were in the displaced people, the DP camp in Germany, my mother very, very gently started to tell us that we were actually not Catholic. But it was Christmas time, and I wanted my Christmas tree. I said, I don't want to be Jewish. If I am Jewish, I am going to be killed. So I don't want to be Jewish. Don't tell me we are Jewish. But my mother persisted. She showed me a Jewish prayer, a Shaddai to say before I went to bed. And I sat on the bed. She said, you don't have to go on your knees. You don't have to make the sign of the cross. Just repeat after me the Shaddai, which I did as an obedient girl that I was. But when she left the room, I went immediately on my knees and I made the sign of the cross and I said the Pater Nostrum. She wanted me to be happy, and against what she wished, she did bring me a Christmas tree, and she made me promise that this would be my last Christmas tree. I kept my promise. It really was the last time I ever had a Christmas tree.
I took the train and went to the border. When I got dark, I started to walk towards the Czech border and walked for a half an hour, and all of a sudden the dog started to bark and the searchlights came on. 6 policemen, Russian, with machine guns, they marched us to the headquarters. And there was a Russian officer. He had 3 gold stars on the shoulder. That officer told the guy to read the charges. Charged me with treason and espionage and carrying Russian money across. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. The Russian money I had, everybody had the Russian money. And the treason and this, I don't even know what it means. I said, I knew that Russia liberated Auschwitz. And I was there with my family, and I came from the Ukraine, and they took us, the whole family. And now, when you guys came in, liberated us, I couldn't find nobody. So I stopped off at every station and look. So he looked at me, and he says, go home. Don't let me ever see you here again. So I went home.
After liberation, Hungary became a communist country because the Soviets have not left. And I grew up during communism. But I must be honest, communism as it was very bad ideologically and very bad politically, to us children, it wasn't that bad at all. We got a decent education. Of course, we were constantly brainwashed and had to go to political discussions and we were told what to think. But at least our lives were not threatened. We all belonged to the Communist Youth Organization and we all had to march out the 1st of May and yell, long live Stalin. You guys are too young to know what the Iron Curtain used to be. But that was nobody in and nobody out of the country. It was unheard of to go to America or go to England or go to anywhere from Hungary. You couldn't get out.
My uncle who lived in Vienna, who was the doctor, in 1938 he was told that because he was a Jew, he was not able to practice medicine anymore. The country in South America called Peru gave him the visa. And so in 1938, he emigrated to Lima and established himself there. When my mother found my uncle, they started writing to each other. He asked her to come with us to Lima, as this was the only family left. And so we made our way to Lima, where we arrived on October 8, 1947. Our first stop was in Paris, in France, to wait for papers. And so we spent 6 months in Paris, and then we took a ship and we crossed the Atlantic Ocean to Rio de Janeiro to Brazil. And from there we took by a 2-motor plane. We flew through Bolivia and arrived in Peru.
I made it to Czechoslovakia. It wasn't easy, but we had to cross the border to Germany. And the Germans didn't have a government at that time. The American army was in charge. They found out that we are Jewish, so they called the chaplain, the rabbi, and he helped us go where we had to go. So we were there 2.5 years in Germany.
In 1956, the students in Hungary had an uprising against the communists. The uprising was successful for a few days. And during these few days, the border was not heavily guarded, and there was a chance to cross the border from Hungary into Austria. We had a school friend whose mother was involved with somehow with the army, or knew somebody in the Hungarian army. And she called us and said that if the boys want to leave, then there will be a truck picking us up in 5 minutes to drive us to the border. And we jumped out of bed, pulled up our clothes, and within 5 minutes we were picked up. We had no time to even say goodbye to our parents. We were on the truck and they took us to the border. And then that night we were taken out to this field. And they told us that there's 2 guard towers, one on the right, one on the left, and that we had to press between these towers. And if they shoot a rocket up, a flare, then we have to just hit the ground and not move. And we walked until we were stopped by the Austrian border police. And that was another feeling of enormous relief that we were captured by the Austrians, because then we were free. The refugee camp in Austria, it wasn't the most comfortable place in the world, but at least our lives were not in danger.
Our ship finally arrived in May. I remember being very seasick. And then we were in America. We had made it. June 14th, 1941. My dad and I stood on the deck, and he said, "We're in a land that's free now." My mom had a twin sister, Lily, but my mom had another sister, an older sister. Her name was Bessie. And Bessie had left Europe early on. She had met a guy from Chicago. What happened was that we arrived, but my Aunt Bessie wasn't there. She had come in March. She had expected us on that ship that we missed. So here we were, a young couple, 2 small children in New York at the harbor. Finally, when they realized that we had no one, we didn't know where to go, the organization called the Hayas, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that helped us get there, came and they put us in a shelter. And finally, my aunt was contacted in Chicago, and she came and got us, and our lives in America started.
When we got in touch with the International Rescue Committee, they arranged a trip for us to America, mainly because we had an uncle here. We left from Bremenhaven, Germany, on an old World War II troop carrying ship. And we were in this large cabin, maybe 150 people to a cabin, in swinging beds, 3 tiers, one on top of the other. That was the very first time I saw the ocean, which was a very exciting thing, until the ship got into a tremendous storm and the ship was thrown around like a little cork. I got so seasick that I swore that I will never again in my life will be on a ship if I can get off this one. To come to America was incredible. You know, the ship pulled into New York Harbor and we passed the Statue of Liberty. That was an incredible sight. The ship docked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and from there we were bused from the ship to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And we were kept in Camp Kilmer, New Jersey until you could find a job and prove that you can support yourself. So I got a job and they let me out and they put me up in Brooklyn in a hotel overlooking Manhattan. I remember sitting in this hotel room. It was in a high floor and absolute perfect view into Manhattan. All of Manhattan was lit up. Every office building had their lights on, and it was an incredible view.
2 years later, after living in Peru, my uncle and my mother fell in love, and they got married. And he adopted us legally and was not only a wonderful doctor, but he was a wonderful husband to my mother and a wonderful father to us. We became conservative, a family, conservative Jewish. I finally adopted this as my own, and I realized that the Catholic part of my life was due to circumstances beyond my help. And at home, my mother and my uncle made a nice Jewish home for us.
Finally, they started to take 10 at a time from all these countries, Brazil, Venezuela, and one day they take them to the United States. Instead of 10, they take 20. And I was one of the lucky 20, got to the United States, and there was a Jewish organization, came and asked us if we have family in the United States. And I said, yes, I have an uncle, and I have an aunt in New York too. And we were 5 people left. They came, they took our names, and one guy came running that my aunt is waiting for me. So I went. I didn't know her, she didn't know me, but she took me home. And after a few months, my uncle sent me a ticket to come to Rhode Island. He heard on the radio, and he saw in the newspaper that David Murmelstein is looking for his uncle, David Murmelstein.
My dad was a rabbi. Pretty soon he started finding different places, shuls and synagogues that were willing to take him in, even though he was a refugee and didn't have good command of the English language. So we went from Chicago to Nashville, Tennessee, from Nashville, Tennessee to Canton, Ohio, from Canton, Ohio to Cleveland, Ohio, where we finally settled down, and I finally went to school.
I got a call from a friend. He says, come here to Passaic, New Jersey. There's a lot of survivors here, and there is a lot of Jewish factories there making clothing. So it didn't take me long, and I came there, and then he found out that there's a factory making men's jackets, and the owner is a Russian Jew, and the foreman is a Hungarian Jew. So I said I fit right in between both of them.
At that time, I couldn't even get in touch with my parents yet, because they were still in a communist country. I first saw them afterwards, several years later, when my parents became retirement age. and that was when the government would let them out of the country. So then I arranged a trip for them to come to America, and that was the first time I really saw them after we left, when they arrived in America.
The first time I came to the United States, I was an exchange student through the American Embassy in Lima. I studied philology, which is the study of languages, and I speak 9 languages. I also have a degree in interior architecture. I left Lima. I went to live in the United States. I met my husband on a trip to Europe. I have 2 children and 6 grandchildren, and they are educating their families in the Jewish tradition. And today I live in Miami, surrounded by my children and my grandchildren. I am blessed that they all live here.
My parents moved down here to Miami Beach, and they never came back. Ted came, and by that time we had an American child in the family, my youngest brother, Hank. I went to Indiana, and I got married, and I had 2 children. Ultimately, I moved here to Miami Beach to be near my parents. I became a high school English teacher. I was selected as the first teacher in the state of Florida to go study in Israel about the Holocaust, along with 30 other teachers. I was put in charge of developing the curriculum for the Holocaust Memorial. And then I was put in charge of all of Holocaust education for the Dade County Public Schools, and I still do that. Tibor became the first federal judge, child survivor of the Holocaust, to be appointed by a president of the United States. And we were so proud of him, our family, and he suddenly died 10 years ago. That was a tragedy that our family could not get over. I took care of him that whole time we were running and hiding. He was like my baby. So that has left a terrible scar. But I have my other brother. He still lives here in Coconut Grove. And I have 2 children, Debbie and David. And I have 4 grandchildren.
Now I'm very happy to have 3 children, and they live here in Miami. 3 grandchildren, and a great-grandson in Brooklyn.
I have a wife, of course, and I have no children of my own. But my wife has 2 sons, and they're my stepchildren, and each of them have 3 kids, so I have 6 grandchildren. I am very much involved with my grandchildren. One of them is going to go on the March of the Living with me this year. I have my twin brother who's still alive, living in Connecticut.
If you could talk to your parents today, what would you say to them?
I would tell them how much I miss them. I would tell them how much I love them.
So if you could speak to your parents today, what would you say to them?
That I was very happy to be with them.
If you could speak to your father today, what would you say to him?
I would tell him that he can be proud of his descendants, that we are good Jewish children that he would have loved to see, and all the suffering and all my anger is gone because in the children I see my vengeance. This is my revenge for what the Germans did to us. I see how many we are, how we have multiplied. And this would make him very, very happy that his death was not in vain.
If you could speak to your parents today, what would you say to them?
I'd say thank you so much, both of you, for being so strong. And the more I talk about our family, the more I realize what you had to go through and how strong you were. And I thank you for that. The Jewish culture is not about the Holocaust. I always say that the Holocaust was a 13-year interruption into the Jewish culture. The Jewish culture is beautiful and happy and living and spiritual, but this was a horrible interruption. And we do need to know about that, and our children need to know about that.
Talk about it. Don't let it forget.
Take advantage of the time you have with the Holocaust survivors and make sure you hear their stories so you could pass them on.
My message to my generation is not let what happened to you define you.
We're all capable of doing, we're all strong. And it is in our power to stop something when we see that it is bad, or somebody is bullying, or somebody is discriminating against somebody because they are different. We are all different, but yet we are the same. We do not want to be bystanders. We and each and every one of us can stand up to evil when it is necessary.
Silence is a very powerful thing.
If we are silent for too long, then bad things can happen and nobody will be able to stand up for themselves.
My message and hope is that all students out there, all young people out there of all nationalities, all ethnicities, all religions, stop and think for a moment that we really are all part of the human race, and that we need to learn to not just tolerate each other, but to respect each other, to understand that we're different, but that we have more in common than we have not in common, and perhaps start practicing a little bit more love for each other and caring for each other. And I have great faith that that will happen.
Don't hate.
Treat people like we want to be treated.
The message is simple. Do not let this happen again. You have to talk about it. You cannot let it be forgotten. Hatred is what creates this. It's happening all around us, and you guys are the only ones who can stop that. Have the guts to stand up to hatred. Don't be a bystander.
The world should not stay silent.
Stand up for what's right.
You shouldn't stay silent, you should take a stand.
Even if it's on a way less scale than the Holocaust, it could still make a big impact.
If in a very little way I can influence your life or your thinking about life, that gives me hope.
I interviewed David Mermelstein. It went really well. He's really sweet and doesn't have any hate against the Germans for what they did.
He just seemed thankful that he survived.
Today I interviewed Anita Carl. It went really well. Anita Carl carried the scarf that her father gave to her, and I thought that was really special because it's a reminder that he's always with her everywhere she goes and that he's always watching over her.
I just hope his story is something I'll think about for a long time and something I'll keep in my mind just so I can be thankful for everything I have.
I interviewed Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff. It went pretty good, emotional. I learned that you should always have hope. I hope to share it with the next generation so that nobody forgets what happened.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank a few people that enabled this project to happen. So first of all, I'd like to thank Tova Rosenberg, the creator of Names Not Numbers, who's been doing this for many years and reviews dozens of these projects across the country and spends an inordinate amount of her own free time doing this. And without her, this would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the Hebrew Academy administration, in particular Mrs. Lucero, our middle school principal, and Rabbi Guttenberg, our head of school, for making this project a priority. Without them, we never would have been able to do this. Next, I'd like to thank our survivors, Dr. Miriam Kasanoff, Anita Carl, Laszlo Selly, and David Mermelstein. The four of you show tremendous courage and morality when you share your stories. I know it must be a very painful experience to relive these stories, but you're really a shining example for these children about continuing to fight for justice and showing them that there is hope even in the darkest times. Lastly, but not leastly, I'd like to thank our students. I'm extremely proud of all of you. You gave up your free time after school, study hall when you could have been finishing homework, to work on this project, and it was really a lot of work. So the video shows the interview and the most interesting parts of the project, but it does not show the painstaking hours you had to endure editing for this project. And I know I pushed all of you pretty hard at times, but I'm proud of you. And you guys, your parents should be proud of you, your community should be proud of you, but most importantly, you should be really proud of yourselves. And this is a project that I really hope that you take with you and think back about and eventually show your children or nieces and nephews and really keep it alive, because the work is not done. And remember, the lesson of this is that it is our responsibility to continue to stand for justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam Kasanoff, for taking the time out of your day, for letting us being able to hear your story. It was honestly very interesting. It was more unique than the stories I usually hear, because you were the only one that I know was able to run away before this whole thing happened, and was always on the run, which I thought was really cool and interesting. And I love how courageous you were to be able to tell your story like it was nothing. A lot of survivors can't really do that. So thank you so much for telling us your story. I'm very grateful for that.
I want to thank Anita Carl for coming and sharing her story with us. After hearing her story from an actual Holocaust survivor, it really changed my perspective, because I was able to ask questions and was really intrigued. One lesson that I took away from her story is that even through the darkest times, you need to find a little bit of strength, because if her mother hadn't found strength and she hadn't found strength, I wouldn't be able to hear her story. The way I'm gonna try to continue her legacy and continue her story is by sharing it with my friends and family, and hopefully they will share it with their friends and family, and her story will never be forgotten.
I'm really glad I joined Names Not Numbers, because I know I got a really cool opportunity that a lot of other people won't have. And now I get to educate other people on the Holocaust and different stories. And I want to say a big thank you to David Mermelstein for sharing his story with us.
Thank you, Miss Anita Carl. Even though you were just a child, I cannot imagine sitting there with a Nazi shooting at your young cousin while eating a bar of chocolate that he offered her. I thought your mother was very brave, and it really took a lot of courage to leave the ghetto at night during the winter with 3 young children into an uncertain future. And it was just to prevent the Nazis from murdering her children. Just like Anita is spreading her story, our generation has an important responsibility to keep the memory of the horrific part of history. Since most of the survivors are no longer alive, I was lucky to have this opportunity, and I'll make sure her story, along with the Holocaust history, is never forgotten.
Hi everybody, so I just wanted to give a huge thank you to Laszlo Sally for sharing his story with me and my friends. It really gave me a bigger understanding and more depth to the Holocaust, and it was really special to me to be able to understand what people really felt like in my past. And I'm so excited to be a part of the chain of sharing your story and passing it on to my friends and my family so they could share the story. And I just wanted to say thank you so much.